The ledger was found in 1923, inside a trunk that had been sealed with tar and buried beneath the floor of a barn in eastern Kentucky. The barn itself had collapsed years before, and the property had changed hands 3 times without anyone knowing what lay beneath the rotted boards. A man digging a foundation for a chicken coop struck the trunk with his shovel and cracked the wood. Inside were papers. Most had deteriorated into pulp, but some remained legible. Among them was a record book kept by someone who signed only as E.M. The entries spanned from March 1878 to November 1882. The handwriting was careful, almost mechanical, as if the writer had been trained in bookkeeping or accounts. But the content was irregular. Some entries were weather observations, others were lists of provisions. Still others were names, followed by dates, followed by nothing. The last entry read, "It has been 3 weeks since anyone went up to the ridge. We tell ourselves this is wisdom. Perhaps it is only cowardice dressed in caution's clothes." No one in the county could say with certainty who E.M. had been or why the trunk had been hidden, but elderly residents remembered stories about the ridge and about the years when certain families stopped coming to church and about the time when the mail carrier refused to deliver past a certain bend in the road. They said something had existed there, but no one had ever seen it. The settlement at Kettle Hollow was not a town in any formal sense. It was a scattering of homesteads along a creek valley, hemmed in by steep wooded hills that rose like walls on either side. The families who lived there had arrived in the 1840s and 1850s, following the promise of cheap land and isolation. They were farmers mostly, though the soil was thin and the growing season short. Some kept hogs. A few worked timber in the winter months. By 1878, there were perhaps 40 people living in the hollow. The nearest actual town was 12 miles south, down a road that turned to mud in spring and froze into ruts in winter. A peddler came through twice a year. A circuit preacher arrived every 6 weeks, weather permitting, to hold services in a cabin that doubled as a schoolhouse. Life was hard, but predictable. People married young. Children died of fevers. Men broke bones and worked through the pain. Women bore children and buried them and bore more. The rhythm of survival left little room for anything else. Elias Marsh kept the only store in the hollow, though store was a generous term. It was a room attached to his house where he sold flour, salt, lamp oil, and tobacco on credit. He also kept the informal records of the community: births, deaths, marriages, debts. He had been a schoolteacher before moving to Kentucky, and he retained the habit of writing things down. It was Elias who began noticing the absences. In late March of 1878, a man named Jacob Finch failed to appear at a barn raising he had promised to attend. This was unusual. Jacob was reliable, and barn raisings were obligations as much as social events. When someone went to check on him, they found his cabin empty. The fire was cold. His coat and boots were missing. A search party was organized. They found Jacob 3 days later near the top of the eastern ridge, lying face down in a ravine. His neck was broken. There were no signs of struggle, no evidence of an attack. The assumption was that he had slipped on loose rock and fallen. The men who carried him down spoke little. One of them, a logger named Samuel Pruitt, mentioned that Jacob's face had looked strange, not frightened exactly, but blank. Like he'd forgotten who he was, Samuel said. But this was dismissed as the natural effect of death, or perhaps the trauma of the fall. Jacob Finch was buried in the small cemetery near the creek. His widow, Martha, moved in with her sister. Within 2 weeks, people had stopped mentioning Jacob's name, except when necessary. In May, a girl named Catherine Lyle disappeared. Catherine was 14, the eldest daughter of Thomas and Rebecca Lyle. She was known for being quiet and dutiful, and for spending her free time wandering the hills looking for herbs and wild greens. Her mother had taught her which plants could be eaten and which could be used for medicine. Catherine had a gift for it. On a Tuesday morning, She left the house with a basket and did not return. By evening, Thomas Lyle had gathered every able-bodied man in the hollow to search. They combed the woods until darkness forced them to stop. The next day they resumed, and the day after that. On the fourth day they found her basket overturned near a deer trail on the western slope. There was no blood, no torn clothing, no signs of violence, just the basket and silence. The search continued for another week but yielded nothing. Catherine Lyle had vanished as completely as if she had never existed. Rebecca Lyle became hysterical. She insisted that something had taken her daughter, though she could not or would not say what. Thomas Lyle, a stern and practical man, told her to stop talking nonsense. But at night, lying in bed, he stared at the ceiling and wondered. The circuit preacher, a thin man named Reverend Alcott, arrived in June and held a memorial service for Catherine. He spoke about God's mysterious ways and the need for faith in times of sorrow. Rebecca Lyle did not attend. She had stopped leaving her house. Elias Marsh recorded both incidents in his ledger. Beside Jacob Finch's name, he wrote, "Accident on Ridge, no witnesses." Beside Catherine Lyle's name, he wrote, "Disappeared, search unsuccessful." But privately, Elias had begun to notice something else. In the weeks following Catherine's disappearance, people in the hollow had grown cautious. They spoke less. They avoided eye contact. When conversations turned to the missing girl, they changed the subject quickly. It was as if an unspoken agreement had been reached. An agreement not to dwell on what had happened, not to ask too many questions. Elias mentioned this to his wife, Hannah, one evening over supper. She looked at him for a long moment before responding. "People are afraid," she said quietly. "Of what?" Hannah set down her fork. "You know what?" Elias did not know. Or rather, he knew something, but could not name it. There were stories, of course. Every isolated place had its stories. In Kettle Hollow, there were whispers about the ridge, about things that lived in the deep woods, about sounds heard at night, about travelers who had gone missing decades before. These were the kinds of tales told to children to keep them from wandering too far from home. But now the stories were being spoken differently, not as entertainment, but as explanation. In July, a man named Owen Driscoll stopped coming to the store. Owen was a bachelor in his 40s who lived alone in a cabin near the northern edge of the hollow. He was known for being surly and reclusive, but he came down once a month to buy supplies and settle his debts. When 2 months passed without a visit, Elias decided to check on him. He took Samuel Pruitt with him, and together they walked the narrow path to Owen's cabin. The door was ajar. Inside, the cabin was in disarray, furniture overturned, dishes broken, a chair lying on its side. But there was no blood, no signs of a fight, and no Owen. They found him the next day, not far from his cabin, sitting with his back against a tree. He was alive, but unresponsive. His eyes were open, but he did not seem to see them. When they spoke to him, he did not answer. When they tried to lift him, he did not resist or react. They carried him back to the hollow and placed him in the care of the midwife, a woman named Ida Coombs. Ida had seen many things in her years, fevers, madness, injuries that defied explanation. But Owen Driscoll baffled her. He was not ill. He was not injured. He simply sat, staring at nothing, as if some essential part of him had been removed. He remained that way for 3 days. On the morning of the 4th day, Ida found him dead. He had not eaten, had not drunk water, had not moved. It was like he'd given up, Ida told Elias, like he'd decided to stop living. That summer, the hollow changed. People stopped going into the hills alone. They traveled in groups, and only when necessary. The children, who once played freely in the woods, were kept close to home. The circuit preacher's visits became more frequent, though attendance at his services did not increase, and people began talking about the ridge. It was never called by name. It was referred to as up there or the high place, or simply it. No one seemed to know exactly what it was, but everyone seemed to agree that it existed. Elias, who prided himself on rationality, found this deeply unsettling. He pressed people for details. What had they seen? What had they heard? But the answers were always vague. A shadow moving where no shadow should be. A sound like footsteps, but not quite. A feeling, a sense of being watched. "You've lived here long enough," Samuel Pruitt told him. "You know what's up there." "I know no such thing," Elias replied. Samuel looked at him with something approaching pity. "Then you're the only one." In August, Elias found a letter tucked into a crack in the wall of his store. It was unsigned, written in a shaky hand on a torn piece of paper. It read, "The thing on the ridge has always been there. Our fathers knew it. Their fathers knew it. It does not show itself, but it takes what it wants. If you do not believe this, ask the old ones. They will tell you." Elias kept the letter. He did not show it to anyone, not even Hannah. But he began asking questions. The oldest person in the hollow was a woman named Opal Hensley, who claimed to be in her 80s, though no one could verify this. She lived in a tiny cabin near the creek and rarely left it. Elias visited her one afternoon, bringing a sack of cornmeal as a gift. Opal received him without surprise, as if she had been expecting him. She sat in a rocking chair by the fire, even though the day was warm, and listened as Elias explained his purpose. When he finished, she was silent for a long time. Then she said, "You want to know about the ridge?" "Yes." "What do you think I'm going to tell you?" "I don't know. The truth, I hope." Opal laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "The truth is what people agree on. And people here have agreed on this. There is something on that ridge, always has been. It doesn't come down and we don't go up. That's the arrangement." "What kind of arrangement?" "The kind that keeps people alive." Elias leaned forward. "But what is it? Have you seen it?" Opal shook her head. "No one's seen it. That's the point. You don't see it and it doesn't bother you. You go looking for it and you don't come back, or you come back wrong. That's superstition. Maybe. But Jacob Finch went up there. So did Catherine Lyle, so did Owen Driscoll, and look what happened to them." Elias had no answer to that. September brought cooler weather and a sense of uneasy normalcy. The harvest was smaller than usual, but people made do. The fear that had gripped the hollow in the summer seemed to fade, or at least recede beneath the surface. But in October, it returned. A young couple, William and Clara Trent, decided to leave the hollow. They were newlyweds, barely 20 years old, and they had family in Ohio. William announced their intention to Elias one afternoon, paying off his debts in full. "We'll be gone by the end of the week," William said. "Why the hurry?" Elias asked. William hesitated. "This place, it's not right. Clara doesn't feel safe here. She'll feel safe in Ohio. Safer than here." They left on a Thursday morning, their belongings packed into a wagon. Several people came to see them off. Though the farewells were brief and awkward, Clara looked pale and frightened. William kept his eyes on the road. They were found 2 days later. The wagon was overturned on the road about 5 miles south of the hollow. The horse was dead, tangled in its harness. William and Clara were lying in the ditch, their bodies twisted at unnatural angles. There were no marks on them, no signs of violence. It appeared as though the wagon had simply tipped over, perhaps due to a broken wheel or a spooked horse. But Samuel Pruitt, who was part of the group that found them, noticed something odd. The couple's faces, like Jacob Finch's, were blank, not peaceful, not frightened, just empty. "They looked like they'd seen something they couldn't understand," Samuel said later, "something that took the life right out of them." The deaths of William and Clara Trent broke something in the hollow. People stopped pretending. The fear that had been whispered about in private was now spoken aloud. There were meetings, informal, held in cabins by lamplight, where people discussed what to do. Some wanted to leave. Others argued that leaving was what had killed the Trents. A few suggested forming another search party, going up to the ridge and confronting whatever was there. This last idea was rejected immediately. No one wanted to go up to the ridge, not anymore. Elias attended one of these meetings, held at Samuel Pruitt's cabin. There were about 15 people present, including Thomas Lyle, Ida Coombs, and a man named Henry Blackwell, who owned the largest farm in the Hollow. The conversation went in circles. People talked over each other, voices rising in frustration and fear. Finally, Henry Blackwell stood and demanded silence. "We all know what's happening," he said. "We've known for years. Hell, our parents knew. Their parents knew. There's something on that ridge, and it doesn't want us there." "That's insane," Elias said. Henry turned to him. "Is it? Then explain Jacob. Explain Catherine. Explain Owen. Explain the Trents. Accidents. Misfortune. Bullshit." Henry's voice was hard. "You're a smart man, Elias. Too smart to be this blind. You've seen the same things we have. You just don't want to admit it." Elias opened his mouth to argue, but found he had no words, because the truth was, he had seen. He had recorded the deaths, the disappearances, the strange absences. He had noticed the fear in people's faces, the way they avoided certain places, certain topics. He had told himself there was a rational explanation, but what if there wasn't? In November, the first snow fell. The Hollow became quiet. People stayed inside, venturing out only when necessary. The store was nearly empty. The circuit preacher stopped coming. Elias spent his days writing in his ledger, trying to make sense of what had happened. He began compiling a list, not just of the recent incidents, but of everything he could remember or find in old records. Disappearances, accidents, deaths that seemed inexplicable. The list grew longer than he expected. In 1863, a man named Josiah Kemp had vanished while hunting. In 1867, 2 children had wandered off and were never found. In 1871, a woman named Sarah Pollard had drowned in the creek under circumstances that were never fully explained, and those were just the ones he could document. There were others, stories passed down, names forgotten, details lost to time. Elias showed the list to Hannah. She read it in silence, then set it down. "What do you want me to say?" "I want you to tell me I'm wrong, that this is coincidence." Hannah looked at him with tired eyes. "You're not wrong, but you're not right either." "What does that mean?" "It means—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "It means that people need a reason for bad things, and if they can't find a reason, they'll make one up. Maybe there is something on that ridge, maybe there isn't, but as long as people believe it's there, it might as well be." In December, a letter arrived for Elias. It had been sent from the town 12 miles south, written by a man named Dr. Franklin Pierce. Dr. Pierce was a physician who occasionally visited the Hollow to treat injuries or illnesses. He had heard about the recent deaths and wanted to offer his assistance. Elias wrote back, inviting him to visit. Dr. Pierce arrived on a cold afternoon in mid-December, riding a sturdy mare and carrying a leather medical bag. He was a man in his 50s, grey-haired and sharp-eyed, with the air of someone who had seen too much suffering to be easily shocked. Elias spent an hour explaining the situation, the deaths, the disappearances, the growing fear. Dr. Pierce listened without interrupting. When Elias finished, Dr. Pierce sat back in his chair and steepled his fingers. "You want my professional opinion?" "Yes. There's a phenomenon," Dr. Pierce said slowly, "that I've observed in isolated communities. People living in close quarters under difficult conditions often develop shared delusions. They create explanations for events that are, in reality, simple tragedies. The mind seeks patterns, even where none exist. You're saying there's nothing on the ridge. I'm saying that fear is contagious, and once it takes hold, it can be more dangerous than any actual threat." Elias considered this. "Then how do you explain the deaths?" "Accidents, illness, suicide perhaps in some cases. Human life is fragile, Mr. Marsh, especially in places like this." "And the disappearances?" Dr. Pierce shrugged. "People wander off. They get lost. They fall into ravines. They run away. Sometimes bodies are never found. It was a rational explanation. a comforting explanation. But Elias found that he did not entirely believe it. Dr. Pierce stayed in the hollow for 3 days. He examined several residents, pronounced them physically healthy, and left. Before departing, he advised Elias to discourage talk of supernatural threats. "The mind is a powerful thing," Dr. Pierce said. "If people believe they are in danger, they will create that danger for themselves." Elias thanked him and watched him ride away. Then he returned to his ledger and wrote, "Dr. Pierce visited, offered explanations. None of them felt true." Winter deepened. The hollow was cut off by snow for weeks at a time. Food ran low. Tempers frayed. People retreated into themselves, into their cabins, into silence. Elias noticed that the fear had not gone away. If anything, it had grown stronger. People spoke less, but their eyes betrayed them. They knew something. They had always known. In January of 1879, Elias decided to do what no one else would. He decided to go to the ridge. He told no one of his plan, not even Hannah. On a clear, cold morning, he put on his warmest clothes, packed a small bag with bread and water, and set out. The climb was difficult. The ridge was steep, the snow deep, and Elias was not a young man. But he pressed on, driven by a need to know, to see with his own eyes what, if anything, existed there. It took him most of the day to reach the top. The ridge was narrow, windswept, covered in bare trees and rocky outcrops. There was nothing unusual about it. No signs of habitation, no strange structures, no evidence of anything unnatural. Elias stood there, breathing hard, looking out over the hollow below. He felt foolish. Dr. Pierce had been right. There was nothing here, just trees and rock and sky. And yet, as he turned to descend, he felt it. Not a sound, not a sight, but a sensation, a weight, a presence, the feeling of being watched by something that did not want to be seen. He froze. His breath caught in his throat. He turned slowly, scanning the trees, the rocks, the shadows. Nothing, but the feeling remained. Elias hurried down the ridge, slipping on ice, stumbling over roots. He did not stop until he reached the bottom. By the time he arrived home, night had fallen. Hannah met him at the door, her face pale with worry. "Where have you been?" "The ridge," Elias said quietly. "You fool, you damn fool." "I had to see." "And what did you see?" Elias hesitated. "Nothing." Hannah stared at him. "Then why do you look like that?" He had no answer. Over the following months, Elias became obsessed. He filled pages of his ledger with theories, observations, questions. He interviewed everyone in the hollow who would talk to him. He searched old records, looking for patterns. What he found was not proof, but something more disturbing: consistency. Every account, every story, every whispered tale pointed to the same conclusion. Something existed on the ridge. No one had ever seen it. No one knew what it was. But it was there, and more than that, it had always been there. Elias found references going back to the 1840s, when the first settlers arrived. A man named Caleb Yost had written in a letter, "The natives warned us against settling in this valley. They said the high place was forbidden. We dismissed this as superstition." In 1852, a woman named Elizabeth Morley had noted in her diary, "The children speak of something watching them from the trees. I tell them it is their imagination, but I confess I feel it too." In 1860, a pastor named Reverend Thaddeus Crane had written, "There is a darkness in this place that no amount of prayer can dispel. I believe we are not alone here." The pattern was undeniable, and yet the thing itself, whatever it was, remained invisible. In March of 1879, exactly 1 year after Jacob Finch's death, another disappearance occurred. A boy named Daniel Marsh, Elias's nephew, went missing. Daniel was 11 years old, bright and curious, the son of Elias's younger brother, Peter. He had been playing near the creek with other children when he wandered off. By the time the other children realized he was gone, it was too late. The search lasted a week. They found nothing. Peter Marsh blamed Elias. "You've been stirring this up," he said. You've been talking about it, writing about it, obsessing over it. And now it's taken my son. That's not... Get out! Get out of my sight!" Elias left. He returned to his cabin and did not come out for 3 days. When he finally emerged, he looked like a man who had aged a decade. Hannah tried to comfort him, but he was beyond comfort. He sat at his desk, staring at the ledger, and whispered, "I should have stopped. I should have left it alone." The hollow fractured. Some families left, abandoning their homes and moving south. Others stayed, but withdrew into isolation, refusing to speak to their neighbors. The communal bonds that had held the settlement together dissolved. Elias stopped keeping the store. He stopped writing in his ledger. He stopped talking. Months passed. Then years. By 1882, Kettle Hollow was nearly empty. Only a handful of families remained, clinging to land they could not sell and lives they could not escape. Elias Marsh died in November of that year. Hannah found him at his desk, slumped over the open ledger. The last entry, written in his careful hand, read, "It has been 3 weeks since anyone went up to the ridge. We tell ourselves this is wisdom. Perhaps it is only cowardice dressed in caution's clothes." The trunk was sealed and buried shortly after Elias's death. Hannah Marsh supervised the work, saying only that her husband's papers should be hidden, not destroyed. She did not explain why. She left the hollow a month later and was never heard from again. The discovery of the ledger in 1923 sparked brief interest. A journalist from Louisville visited the area and wrote an article about the Kettle Hollow mystery. But the people who still lived in the region refused to be interviewed. When the journalist pressed them, they told him to leave. The article was never published. In 1957, a graduate student named Margaret Elias wrote her thesis on the settlement patterns of eastern Kentucky. She included a brief section on Kettle Hollow, noting that it had been abandoned by 1885 and never resettled. She wrote, "The reasons for the community's dissolution remain unclear. Local folklore attributes the abandonment to supernatural causes, but this is almost certainly a post hoc rationalization for more mundane factors such as economic hardship, disease, or social conflict." She did not mention the ledger. It is unclear whether she knew about it. In 1981, a fire destroyed the county courthouse where many of the old records were stored. Most of the documents related to Kettle Hollow were lost. In 2003, a hiker named James Kellerman reported finding the ruins of a cabin near the eastern ridge. He described it as eerie and said he had felt an overwhelming urge to leave. He did not return to the area. In 2015, a developer purchased the land that had once been Kettle Hollow, intending to build vacation homes. The project was abandoned after 2 construction workers quit, citing bad vibes. The land remains undeveloped. The ridge is still there. People do not go there. When asked why, they say, it's just better not to. The question that remains is not whether something existed on the ridge. The question is what it was. Some believe it was a predator, a bear, a wildcat, something that attacked people who strayed too far from safety. But this does not explain the lack of bodies, the absence of physical evidence. Others believe it was human, a hermit, a criminal, someone who preyed on isolated individuals and left no trace. But this does not explain the consistency of the fear, the way it was passed down through generations. Still, others believe it was nothing at all, a shared delusion, as Dr. Pierce suggested, a collective madness born of isolation and hardship. But those who lived in Kettle Hollow, those who felt the weight of the ridge, who saw the blank faces of the dead, who carried the names of the missing like stones in their pockets, they knew differently. They knew something had existed there. They also knew it had never appeared. Elias Marsh's ledger sits in a private collection now, unread. The pages are fragile, the ink faded, but the words remain. We tell ourselves this is wisdom. Perhaps it is only cowardice dressed in caution's clothes. And perhaps it is something else entirely. Perhaps it is survival. The hollow is quiet now. The cabins have rotted away. The creek runs clear. The ridge looms above, covered in trees that have grown thick and tall. If you listen carefully, people say you can still hear it. Not a sound exactly, more of an absence of sound, a silence that presses down like a hand. But no one listens carefully anymore. No one goes there. And the thing, whatever it was, whatever it might still be, remains unseen, as it always has, as it always will.